Hey, what's up? Was that like a fist bump in the air? All right, I love it. We are scattered like the people Israel. And no, but it's great to be here and to have all of you in the room. There is a handout. I think I put them on most of the tables where people are located. If you can't, if there's not one on your table, then it looks like there certainly should be extras in some other spaces. What I'd like to do then is to share my screen and see, we will start the slideshow. Technology. Okay, can anybody see that? All right, great, perfect. Okay, well, this is week 3 of our class, Crossing the Bridge. The subtitle of which is a closer look at how we live missionally. Our first 2 classes together, our objective was really to do some ground clearing. What do we mean when we use the language of mission? Is there a way for us to conceptualize mission as less about someone who goes somewhere else and more about all of us, in some sense, are called or sent, and we have the opportunity to discern what that looks like in each of our contexts. Last week, I want to just kind of remind you a couple of pieces, and then I had a little bit left, but we're now this week going to start to really pivot in the direction of the history of the transmission or spread of the gospel, the Jesus way. Last week, what I did at the beginning, though, was I pitched for you. My first week, I think I told you that I was utilizing the work of my good friend Stina Jost, and I felt like I needed to follow that up with something of my own. So that's what I kind of did last week. Is I gave to you what I would propose is a good, I think, working theology of mission. And a theology of mission really is meant to guide how we think about mission. It might be to guide the kind of missional partners we're going to have. And I hope that it could be of use to you as you think about, well, what does it mean for me to live into this? Because mission can mean so many different things. And I offer to you really 2 sort of parts of this. One was sort of just the overarching umbrella that I want to suggest that we're trying to become good neighbors. Becoming a good neighbor is a good way, I think, of thinking about mission. And we broke down each of those words, the becoming word, neighbor word, and good, to get out what we were talking about, this sense of a process and a journey that will continue to go. Looks like Elaine's trying to get in, but she's having some trouble. I then try to fill that out with a little bit more to think about in that regard, in terms of hospitality, solidarity, and sojourning, that these were sort of 3, what I called postures, dispositions, practices that could help fill out or kind of guide with a little bit more specificity, but still allowing us to have the kind of improvisational freedom that I think we're called to as we do this. We're called to follow Jesus, but we're not going to do it in exactly the way that Jesus did it, because precisely Jesus wants us to live out the gospel call here and now, right? We're not first century Palestinian Jews. We're something else. We live in a different context. We have different kinds of challenges. And so that sense of improvisational freedom, that's what I'm talking about. But these 3, I think, are rooted pretty well, actually, in what we see, the way that we see God engaging the world. And of course, one of the central points I tried to make, particularly starting in class 1 and in last week as well, was this sense that the number one thing that we want to do is get away from the idea that mission is primarily the work of the church, and understand rather that God is the missionary, that mission really is God's business, that God is the one who is at work in the world, and that our calling is to discern what that looks like in our neighborhood and participate, right? That's sort of the idea there. And so hospitality, solidarity, sojourning, I think these all, we can find definite correlates in the way that God is God, in a sense, towards us. Then we pivoted after that last bit of sort of theological reflection, I wanted to provide some more historical data as we thought about the spread of the Jesus way. And part of what I've been doing as we've been moving through and talking through is highlighting the fact that the terminology of mission was not used in the early church to describe what you and I might think of as missionary work. There was a word, there were certainly words that can be translated in that way, but the church didn't typically talk about that. They utilized other terms like apostle and evangelist, but those words had a variety of meanings that could include something like what we might think of as mission and might include some additional things. Yet nevertheless, the gospel spreads, the church grows, etc. So that's kind of been sort of the dilemma. If we don't necessarily have the language, but we still have something that's happening. So I made a couple of, I think, hopefully helpful observations in this regard. And the first one really is meant to undermine an over-reliance on the idea that mission is a highly organized enterprise in the life of the church, especially prior to the 15th century, because that just is simply not the case. It's something that happens clearly because the gospel spreads, but it doesn't necessarily happen because there is, quote unquote, an office of missionary, right? And so I talked a little bit about this, that there is, of course, some evidence of deliberate sending. We can point, of course, to the Apostle Paul and his apostleship. But if you go into Acts and you read, it doesn't say he's going to be a missionary necessarily, but he still is sent, and he still is doing that kind of work that we might think or we might attach to that. And then there's other evidence that I said that we find as we read into the writings of the early church. I think I particularly cited Origen, who's kind of writing at the end of the second and into the early part of the 3rd century, and then Eusebius, who's about a century after that. But typically they are talking about phenomena or people who are going around preaching as if it's something that the church really doesn't do anymore. So by the time we're up into the 4th century, basically evangelist as an office of the church has kind of fallen out of use, etc. And yet, again, nevertheless, the church spreads, the faith spreads. So how does that mostly happen? Well, it mostly happens through migration, through everyday people migrating, sometimes voluntarily, but probably more often than not involuntarily. And when they do, they take the faith with them. And eventually, when they go to these new places, whether voluntarily or not, and I think I talked a little bit about, we don't know, for instance, who founded some of the key early centers of Christianity, because again, there was no organized sort of thing that we know about. So then what was the last piece? It was the idea that after you go to this new place, you begin to share everyday life with your neighbors. And in so doing, that is what becomes attractive potentially for others to be drawn to the Jesus way. Now, the phenomenon of conversion is also hard to get at, and so I'm going to kind of highlight a little bit of that when we talk in just a bit about some of what we want to really hit on today. Let me just kind of fill out this a little bit more. This was all, again, last week. So there was a little bit of material left that I wanted to kind of highlight for you, and I want to kind of talk about, well, what is entailed in the spread? So what are the methods in very broad brush, particularly in the kind of early life of the church, maybe the first 1,000 or so years? And I have basically 4 things I want to highlight here, and then we're going to turn a little bit more quickly into some historical stuff. The first is that what we see is it's holistic in its orientation, and that missional endeavor includes, of course, preaching the gospel, but it does more than that. It includes acts of service that can come in the form of caring for the poor, or oftentimes, especially as we move into kind of later, kind of 600, 700, 800 establishment of hospitals or providing of health care and things of that nature becomes a significant component of what Christians are doing missionally. The second thing is and this would not be language necessarily that they would have used, but a kind of contextual sensitivity is something that we can discern. And what I mean by that is as we go into these different areas, you can find myriad examples of attempts to be contextually sensitive. And we talked a lot in those first 2 weeks together about one of the key things that we need to do as we think about a missional engagement is learn how to listen. We have to listen to those whom we believe we're being called to serve in order precisely to discern not only what the needs are, but what they might experience as good. And that's what I think contextuality kind of gives to us. So we can find the use of language, of custom, of political structure, and in some cases, which I'll share one with you next week, even an attunement to the religious imaginary or the religious thought world that people lived in, that maybe the Christian gospel could find some connecting points. And I'll share some of that with you as well. The third thing that I think is important to note is the phenomenon of translation. And very early on in the life, I think it's important, I think it's probably really important to remember, of course, that the Christian Bible is not, fully formed or shaped, even in a provisional fashion until we get up into the 4th century. So it takes a while for that to develop. But early on, at least into the 2nd century, texts that are considered central to the life of the church are already being translated into other languages. And two of the great examples of that are the Coptic language and Old Latin. So it's being translated out of Greek into these other languages for people who speak them to be able to use them. So translation as an actual sort of scriptural, like an actual phenomenon is something that is, there are just reams of examples of this. As well, of course, as translating the liturgy. So the structure of worship actually needs to be able to communicate to the people, so that they can understand it. And so the use of Syriac and Coptic and Berber and Old Latin and Georgian. There's all these kinds of examples that are going to pop up relatively quickly in the life of the church. But translation is not just the actual work of translating. It also, I think, is another way of describing contextuality to a certain extent. Because we are always trying to translate what we truly believe or the way that we want to live to others, right? So that it can make sense. So it requires then also, of course, attending to the thought world and not just the language that other folks have or use. And I'm going to make an argument next week that translation, for some at least, is the central metaphor for thinking about mission, period. And I'll draw on the work of a Nigerian scholar for this, but his argument is basically that God has been translating God's self to us all along the way. That's all God is doing. When God becomes human, it's so that we can understand a little bit better, right? That's kind of the idea. So translation as a deeply rooted practice that has this kind of theological architecture behind it is, I think, important. That, of course, takes a long time to really develop. The last point I really wanted to make was about the question of diversity. And one of the things that we find in the history of the transmission is that those who receive the faith are just as important oftentimes as those who transmit it. And the reason that they're important is not just because they become people who hear the gospel and then become Christians, but because they hear it distinct to them. And in that doing, they might hear it differently than you meant it. But that is part of the process, in a sense, of the growth of the church. And so that's what I mean here, the truth of Catholicity. This word Catholic is just simply means universal. It doesn't specifically mean the Roman Church. This is why it's called the Roman Catholic Church. It means universal, and we usually use this term, or when we think about it, like if you probably don't sit around reciting the Nicene Creed or anything. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But if you have, there are these 4 marks that you get to in both the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed: one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. These are all the marks of the church. I think it'd be fair to say that probably in our minds, if we knew what Catholic meant, that it means universal, we probably think on some level that there's a kind of sameness that links all Christians together. And there's certainly truth to that, but that's what the word one means. So Catholic, I think, actually means, or is another way of talking about the profound diversity. And so one of the great gifts that kind of happens, and sometimes to the chagrin of the people of the church that exists, or the people who are sent or whatever, is precisely the freedom of those who receive it to make it into something new. And there's so many wonderful examples, but I'll just cite, to me the most striking one is the creation of the Afro-Protestant church under the conditions of slavery. I mean, typically the gospel was used, or wanted to be used, as an instrument of oppression, but Afro-Protestant enslaved persons heard it and made it into something else because they heard something else. It became a language of freedom for them. That's a great example. There's all kinds of other examples too that maybe don't have quite as much power as that, but nevertheless. So, improvisational reception is an important thing to keep in mind, which means then that if we go into we take a missional engagement posture with partners, and we start to discern and learn, and we find a way to be of service, they may receive it very differently and make of it something that we don't know what to do with. But that's part of the process. Like success, in other words, is not re-replicating us into them. It's allowing them to be them. It's allowing the Jesus that they hear to come forth from them. So that's very important. So improvisational reception. So once it's transmitted, receivers play as much, if not more, important a role. And then the last comment that I wanted to make, when you get into the period that we're going to be talking really about for the next kind of 3 weeks or so, is what does it mean what is conversion? What does that mean? And I find it very, very difficult to get a workable definition of the word conversion that is not freighted with all kinds of bad baggage about culture, about westernization, or even Christianization, even when this is happening prior to. It's also, I think, very difficult for us to pierce the motives of people. We want conversion to mean a transformation of the heart. Well, people in the ancient world didn't necessarily think about human beings in that way. So conversion can be many different things. And people can convert for many different reasons, and they can choose not to convert for the same many different reasons, and they can choose to sort of partly convert, or not, to combine a former religious tradition with the Christian faith. So there's a very wide range here in the phenomenon and the phenomenology, really, of kind of missional interaction and stuff, and we just want to keep that in mind as we're sort of moving through the history. The last point I really was going to make last week, I'm going to kind of skim through it here very quickly so we can move into what I want to talk about today, is it's an attempt again to decenter the idea that there was only one center. Oftentimes when we talk about mission work or missional engagement, we think about center and periphery, or we think about missional engagement as spreading the periphery. And what we need is a sort of different model, basically, I think, because there's some problems built into that way of thinking. And I think one of the main things that we can do if we look actually at the history of the early church is to realize that there was never only one center, and there was never only one language, right? There were multiples. And now, in the world that we live in now, I mean, we receive as many missionaries in our country as are sent, right? So this, I think, is a better, more helpful way of thinking about missional engagement, but it can also then speak to us, I think, kind of indirectly about this idea that I mentioned before with this the bridge. It's a two-way street. We're going to be changed as much as anyone else is if we do this, if we engage, or at least we should. That should be the case. So the example I wanted to offer really to make this point was that text in Acts chapter 2, which is provided for you on the outline. I'm not going to read this, but if you kind of go through, the basic idea, right, is that the Spirit is poured out and all the apostles which are gathered are speaking in languages, and these are actual languages, right? And so you hear Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, et cetera, et cetera. If you go through that, you'll find actually that I think more, it's at least half, if not more, are languages that are outside of the Roman Empire, as opposed to inside. So there's this kind of I don't know if it's transnational, I don't know if the language of national works at this point in time, but it's clearly transcends the Roman Empire. So what are the insights? The first, of course, locations and languages that are well beyond the Greco-Roman world. And what's the point? The point is that at the very inception of the church, and that really in some ways, many people will say Acts chapter 2 is the birth of the church. From the very beginning, it's a multi-centric polyglot or polycentric or polyglot phenomenon. It's already at its start many different potential ways of being Christian. And what do I mean by that? I simply mean that when you think and dream in different languages, you're going to conceptualize and live in the world slightly differently, or maybe profoundly differently than others. And that's just the reality that we know. And so the two examples I wanted to offer were the early translations of scriptural texts into Syriac and Coptic, which eventually lead these communities, for other kinds of reasons, but I think on some sort of a continuum, they will eventually break away from the Roman church or the church within the empire, the Greek-speaking church. And they'll kind of go their own way. This happens both with the Syriacs and the Coptics. And I'm not condoning or wanting to say we should break up. As we're all Protestants, I don't need to talk more about us being schismatic than we already are. But my point is simply that early in the history of the church, you already have this phenomenon of Catholicity that is so profound that it actually even leads to disparate communions and therefore different centers, right? So it's polycentric as opposed to singular. All right, let me stop there and see. I've given you a fair amount to throw at you. None of you have had any coffee yet. Some of you are way in the back and I can kind of see you. So are there any comments, thoughts, things that you want me to clarify a little bit? We do have a microphone up here that Rick is happy to share. Hold on, just here it comes. This will go online for us.
Thank you. When you were speaking, it made me think of that old story illustration about the elephant and many people who were blind touching the elephant and thinking they had the whole truth. Well, actually, the trunk is what an elephant is like. Well, no, actually, his tail. Well, no, actually, his massive leg. And each one thinking that they had the truth. So I really appreciate your point about our needing to be sensitive. And I love it that you've been talking about people coming to the Jesus way rather than just Christianity, because the disciples, the apostles, stayed Jews. They were still going to the synagogue.
Yeah.
And Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the reasons why I do prefer that language, particularly in this early period where the merger of Greco-Roman culture and sort of Christian belief hasn't happened, and the benefits and the problems with that merger, obviously. And the earliest way of describing this was the way, right? So the Mandalorian does not have a one-up on Jesus. Jesus is the one who talked about the way first. None of you people probably watch Disney Plus. Maybe Rick does. Those of you online, you will get what I'm talking about. Okay, so let me move us forward then. So I wanted to set up and give you some of these conceptual tools as a useful set of tools, really, and kind of do some ground clearing. And then I want us to turn and kind of engage some tradition. Did you have a comment? Oh, wait, maybe you can.
So looking at this verse, it reminds me of, it's kind of the nuclear explosion of the Holy Spirit going out and being in people's lives. He didn't present that way in the Old Testament. This way, the Holy Spirit is something new. And that's, I think, is a big part of how the gospel spread. Jesus said, you're going to, at least to his disciples, you're going to have powers of healing. And all of that went on, I assume. And people were marveling, and they were spreading the gospel in that way. And that kind of faded, just like till what it is today. You don't see that kind of, at least material presentation of the Holy Spirit anymore. So, it's just a comment.
In some places, you actually will see quite material expressions. Yeah. But thank you for that. Yeah, the spread of the Spirit. Dave, I need to move forward. Can you, or do you? He's got a comment. It's going to happen.
Yeah, in our experience working with Muslims in our studies, we've realized that conversion, changing religions, is not in the Bible. So one of our favorite passages on this is Acts 3:19. It says, "Repent ye therefore and be converted, when the times of refreshing shall come by the presence of the Lord." So it's really a change of heart and identity in terms of Jesus and not religion.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Dave. And as I was doing this, as I was thinking about this, I've actually had conversations with you and Sherry precisely about this issue. And I've really appreciated your thinking and your practice in that regard. All right, so the first real sort of tradition that I want to get us to think about, I'm going to kind of, as we move through these weeks, I'm going to try to clump together. Sometimes they're going to be obvious that it works. Other times it's going to be completely arbitrary. But I'll do my best to justify it. I want to talk this week about what I'm calling God's Wanderers, and I'm speaking here specifically about the Irish tradition. And one of the reasons I want to do this is, in part, I want to put before you a question at the end if we have time to talk about it. If not, I want to kind of challenge you to go home and think about it. But basically what we find if we look at the documents in the early history of the church, all the way again up to about the 14th, 15th century or so, the way that people who were doing something like missional engagement, the way they talked about themselves was they utilized the term pilgrim, that they were a pilgrim, that they were on pilgrimage. And so this tradition in particular has a very, very strong and pronounced engagement with that. It's really up to the eve of the Crusades. And I mean this in the sense that the people who send them talk about them as pilgrims, the people who are sent talk about themselves as pilgrims, and they talk about what they're doing as essentially an act of pilgrimage. And I'll get into what that looks like, because that looks slightly differently. So I kind of want to challenge us to think about what if we used that language, how would it challenge, change, enhance what we mean by missional engagement if we utilize this category of pilgrim. So let me kind of illustrate a little bit about what does pilgrim mean by talking through some of this tradition. First of all is the terminology in Latin at least, for pilgrim that is prominent in Irish figures is this term peregrinatio. And it literally does, it can be and does mean pilgrimage, but it actually means a little bit more than that. If you can, there's a deeper connotation, which is the second one, that one becomes an exile for God or for Christ. And so there is a sense of moving into places that are in which you are not familiar, or it is not comfortable. It would not be your space necessarily. And you do that in a kind of exilic posture. And I'll kind of go through that. It looks differently for different ones of these folks, but we'll kind of talk about this. This term, of course, has a pre-Christian meaning to go on pilgrimage. But in the Irish church, pilgrimage actually takes on a kind of penitential sensibility that you, in other words, you sometimes decide that you're going to go wandering in order to cleanse yourself, or in order to find yourself, or in order to be found. And so it takes on this, it's not just about traveling. It's not just about, certainly at this point, it's not about going to see relics necessarily. It's really that it's literally like the actual historical embodiment of reading a novel. I mean, think about it. What happens in almost every novel? The protagonist takes some kind of journey through that novel, and that is the journey of transformation. Well, that structure probably is borrowed from earlier reflections on the nature of pilgrimage, but to go on this journey is precisely to be transformed by it. And these people talk about what they're doing as that. They're being changed as much as they're doing any changing to anyone else. Now, to kind of hit that note that we've talked about before, we don't exactly know when Christianity showed up, because, right, it spreads mostly by migration. It's the same thing in Ireland. If you've been operating with St. Patrick, came in and did his limericks and drove the snakes out of Ireland, and that's when Christianity came. No, that is incorrect. No one laughed at that. I thought I'd get some laughs. I'm actually Irish, so I think I can make fun of myself and my tradition if I want to, so you can laugh. We do know that there is a Christian presence in Roman Britain, particularly in the southern and eastern part of the British, of kind of the section that we would typically call England, by about the 3rd century or so. Again, we don't know how it got there precisely. There's some legendary accounts, but those are that. They are simply legendary. The faith spreads from that eastern southern section. It doesn't really go north, but it goes westward into what would be called modern day Wales. And so it makes that move into there. And importantly to remember, around the year 410 is when the Romans withdraw from Britain. And so there's a kind of new sort of political power vacuum and a new set of situations that present themselves. What we can say is that by around the year 431, again, this is slightly before Patrick actually returns to Ireland, we have documentation of a small Christian community located south of Dublin asking for a bishop. And typically, if you have a small Christian community that needs a bishop, they've probably been there 2 to 3 generations, is more than likely the case. So a man named Pallidus was consecrated as bishop and sent to that region, and he mostly ministers in that area, primarily encouraging this small community. The real figure, though, even though I said it's not true that Patrick's the one that brings Christianity, it's clearly true that he helps to reinforce and build it up. And so he really is a major character in the telling of the story of Christianity in Ireland. I'll kind of walk through his sort of some details here in terms of him. Born into a very wealthy Christian family, he lives on the western coast, basically in what would be modern day Wales. He was culturally Roman, but he's ethnically Welsh. So he speaks a Celtic language and would have sort of had some facility with Latin, but apparently his Latin was not very good. But he's really, he does have facility with a Celtic language, Welsh, which of course is going to help him when he's sent to Ireland because they have a language that's quite similar. As I mentioned, his family is wealthy, and they have deep connections in the church, in the local church. His father served as a deacon in the local church, which is a position of significance, and his grandfather had actually been a priest. So again, this is a community that's been there for a while. Patrick, when he reflects on his early life, says he did not necessarily embrace the faith, early on at least. But there's an incident that's going to happen that kind of gives us some sense. And in terms of the sources that we really have, the best is that Patrick wrote his own confession, and then we have this very strongly worded letter in which he denounces Irish slavery because he himself experiences that, and that moves us into this. And at age 14, he is abducted from the estate because it's raided by Irish slavers, and he's sold into slavery. And effectively, the Irish Sea really was a lot like the Mediterranean in the sense that you had different cultures interacting with one another, influencing one another, trading with one another, and of course, robbing one another. And that's what happens here. He experiences something that would not be all that unique in a sense. He winds up getting sent to Western Ireland, so the western coast. So what in his mind, and what in many people's minds would have been the edge of the earth, right? This is the edge of the known world for someone like that. And he works mostly as a sheep herder. This is what he tells us. And it's during this time that he winds up embracing the faith. He's got a lot of time to think, basically, is the way that he describes it. And he's out there with these sheep. What else is he going to do but pray and reflect is kind of the idea. And then apparently they started to mock him and call him the holy boy. But here's his own account. He says, after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep, and many times a day I prayed. The love of God and his fear came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened. So this experience becomes sort of essentially where it takes root for him, and he begins to understand himself as genuinely Christian, trying to follow after Jesus. He saw a vision. He has a series of visionary experiences over the course of his life. The earliest vision, though, is one where he basically sees a vision for how he should escape. And that's what he does. So at age 20, so 6 years, he escapes, he hops on a ship, and he makes it back to Wales, and he's welcomed back by his family. He then, I don't really have something up here, but he then decides he's going to pursue a career in the church. He starts to study for the priesthood, etc. And he has some visions over the course of the next many years. One of the most important ones is the vision of someone named Victorinus. We don't really know if Victorinus is a person that he actually knew in Ireland, but he says he has this vision of someone named Victorinus coming to him with a letter which is from all of Ireland. And that letter reads out as follows: "O holy boy, we beg you to come again and walk among us." So that mocking title makes its way into his vision. And he hears this, and this is really the one that sort of begins to stir his heart to potentially go back to Ireland. Now, he does not immediately go back. It's like 10 or 15 years at least, if not more, before he actually returns. So he does not immediately return because of this vision, but that becomes important for him. So when he does return, he returns somewhere around the year 450. There's some debate about this dating. And there's some debate about whether or not he had been commissioned by Rome or not, whether he just went on his own. It's not entirely clear precisely what the case is. So what does he do? He spends really a lot of time making significant inroads with the various clans that organized and populated Ireland. Supposedly there were the numbers, I mean, these numbers are hard to know for sure, but there were something like 150 different clans. Some of those might have been sub-clans. I don't know about the clannish structure of Ireland, but all I'll say is apparently he made contact with at least about a third of them. So 40 out of the 150 had some kind of influence, and by that I mean some people seem to have responded, some clans adopted, some clans partially adopted. Maybe they gave him land to build a church or a monastery, whatever the case may be, but you have that sense of connection. That is far more significant than anything that the earlier guy, Palladius, does. Remember, Palladius only is working among people who are already Christians. This guy's actually traveling around and talking to them about the gospel, and they are not Roman, and they are certainly not Christian. They're pagan. When he would do this, he would work within the social structure that he found, which meant typically that he would approach the leader or the chieftain of a clan, persuade that person to, at the very least, allow him to preach. And sometimes he would persuade the chieftain to accompany him, which oftentimes was helpful because this is a time, as you can imagine, of significant violence. And so if you showed up somewhere without a letter of approval or person of approval, you could have a quick end. As he worked with both established communities, Christian communities, and with pagans. And one of the key things that he does, and kind of one of the key legacies that Patrick leaves and actually winds up marking much of Irish Christianity, is the establishment of monasteries. Now, a monastery, I know when we think about a monastery, I don't know what you think about, but maybe it's not positive, I don't know. But a monastery, it actually was quite significant. There, as I mentioned here, there are almost no towns or major centers of population to speak of in Ireland at this time. When Patrick goes around and begins to establish these monasteries, they wind up becoming later the groundwork for a town. And the reason for that is that monasteries are more than just men or women stuck in a cell praying all day. They are actually these significant repositories of culture, learning, healthcare, etc., sources of trade and whatnot, alongside of religious instruction and other kinds of instruction. In fact, what we find at least 2 generations later is that monasteries are mostly responsible for educating not just the priestly class, but anyone else who needs an education. So he believes in institutions, I think is one thing we could say. He sees his missional engagement in part as creating structures that work, that are flexible, that work, and that have some sense of lasting. Now, a question that you will encounter in studies of Patrick was the extent to which he might be described as a cross-cultural missionary. Obviously, none of those words are words that he used to describe himself. He talks about himself, as I said before, and I'll say again at the end here, as a pilgrim. But the cross-cultural piece is actually pretty tantalizing to think about, because he is going to peoples who do not identify themselves with the cultural traditions that he would have been familiar with. That is, they are not Roman. They're not completely out of the realm, because he would have had that Welsh connection. But he really is the first person in any kind of like mission studies that we can point to in the history of the church, who decides that they're going to go and missionize among people who are not already a part of the kind of people groups within the Roman Empire, or within maybe the Persian Empire would be the only other place. So in that sense, he's crossing over to speak to barbarians, and not in order to turn them into Romans. And so that is a pretty important moment of making that move. In that engagement, he learns the Irish language, the dialect of the Celtic dialect that would have not been too hard. And as I said before, he was already not very good at Latin, so he probably needed that. He wandered around from clan to clan. and making inroads, setting up institutions as he was able. He also spoke against slavery. Obviously, he has a ground from which to do that because he himself had been enslaved. But he gives one of the strongest arguments against slavery in his little letter to Coroticus. And there's a distinct possibility that he adopted the dress of the Druids. So the Druidic class, that would have been the form, like they would have been sort of the priestly types within sort of Irish pagan social structure. And they dressed a very particular way. And the reason that there's a possibility that Patrick may have done this is that within a generation or two, almost all Irish monks were dressing in this way. And so more than likely, Patrick set up that as an example. That at least is one thing that we find, or at least one possibility. So lastly, God's exile. This is literally how Patrick talked about himself in the materials that we have that he has written. He understands himself as being sent on exile. He understands himself as a pilgrim. That's what he thinks about in terms of what he's doing. And again, the purpose of being on exile and being sent on pilgrimage is for you yourself to be changed and transformed. So that is central to how he's thinking about the work that he is doing and what he is trying to accomplish. Let's see, what time is it? All right, we're not doing too bad, but we're not doing too great either. Here are some images for you. The one on the left, these are the main kingdoms. Or this, I think, was around the time. You know, there is so much crap on the internet about St. Patrick that it's hard to know, you know, what is healthy for you and what is not. But this left one, I think, is pretty usable in terms of the larger clans. And I've given to you these other two maps. So the one there in the middle shows you the island of Iona, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And on the other is this red dot, and that's where the monastery of Lindisfarne is located. I'm going to talk about that in just a second too. Before I move on, though, are there any comments in the room? Okay. All right. Well, let me jump ahead then, just given our time. We want to talk about, I have three more figures sort of that fit into this. The first one is Columba, and I'll kind of bring together his early life and his own pilgrimage, which is different than Patrick. Patrick's is a voluntary exile, essentially. Columba's is a little bit more mixed. He appears to have come also from a wealthy family. He lives in Ireland. I believe it's in Northern Ireland, close to Derry, actually. He's educated in a monastic school, and decides that he wants to take on the life of becoming a church figure, priest, or a monk. And in so doing, he joins a monastery, monastic community, and then eventually he winds up founding several other monasteries in Ireland. So this was a big part of the way that the church organized itself, was around creating these institutions, these repositories as we describe them. Somewhere around 560 or so, I have here 563, but it's like 561, 563, somewhere in there. He has to go into exile. He winds up leaving Ireland. It's not entirely clear. So there's a strange couple of stories. One is that he got into trouble for copying a manuscript that he wasn't supposed to, which seems hard to believe that someone would get exiled for that, but maybe. The other is that he was involved in a rivalry between his home clan and another clan, and he talked his home clan into slaughtering. So about 3,000 people died. And then the last version I heard was a mixture of the two. He copied a manuscript he shouldn't have copied and got into trouble, and then he encouraged people to kill a bunch of people. So it's not clear. I don't exactly know what happened, but around 561, this seems to happen. And he takes this peregrinato, and again, here it's not clear, is this a self-imposed sentence, or is this one that is put upon him by the church? That also is not clear. So, penitential exile. So, basically, he's leaving, but he's not leaving because he wants to become a missionary. He's just leaving because he has to leave. And so what does any monk do when they leave? They go found a monastery, right? Because that's what you do. So he goes to the island of Iona, the one that I showed you before, off the western coast of Scotland. And he went into exile actually with a number of companions, and together they found a monastery on that small island. And they secure permission to be there from the local tribal king. And that becomes basically a base of operations as a center of learning and an example for other monasteries that are going to wind up start popping up across the British Isles and down into Europe, France, Italy, which are then also going to become centers of learning, which eventually will produce universities. So, let me see here. Becomes a model. All right, what's he doing while he's there? He decides that he wants to interact with the local ruler, which he, of course, has to do because he needs the land. So he goes to visit the king of the Picts, which is King Brute. You gotta love that name, King Brute. And in so doing, in this interaction with the king, and over time he picks up and learns the Pictish language. He works with the local rulers, both King Brute and other kings in the region, and basically starts a ministry of itinerant preaching. So he's kind of wandering around preaching and caring for people whom he encounters who are sick or poor. And of course, there are some stories of miraculous healings that are connected to him, but that's a more difficult one to kind of get at. But this sort of holistic sensibility shapes what he's doing. As he's doing this, as he's engaging the Pictish people, he also is struck by their skill as artisans, particularly as stone carvers, but also as book illustrators. And so the Picts were well known for their elaborate designs and their use of animal and other kinds of figures. And he basically begins to incorporate that. And this is where some of the famous Irish and Scottish stone crosses come from, is from that marriage of those cultures. So he adopts this and adapts it. Both he does and his later kind of disciples at Iona do that as well. The most famous example of this, of course, is the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells is produced well after Columba is dead. But that idea of openness, right, of learning and of receiving as much as you are giving, that marks, of course, his missional engagement. All right, lastly, I have 1 minute. We're going to do it. We can do this together. It might go over a minute or two, I don't know. The last two I want to talk about are Kombanus and Aiden. And you can find Kombanus also described under the name Columban or Columban as well. So they kind of follow in a sense. Kombanus kind of similar kind of story, starts out in Ireland, born in a village, receives a very good education. We don't really know the background of his family, or at least I wasn't able to find anything on that. Apparently, he's a very charismatic figure, charismatic preacher, charismatic talker, has a strong personality, which was a great benefit, but it could also be a liability because sometimes he would come into conflict with people. And that included not only political leaders, but other bishops, particularly Roman bishops. He did not seem to like them, and they didn't seem to like him. Around 590, he's been living at this point in time from early life up to then in a monastery, and he requests to be let go. He's basically like, I'm tired of being in this place, and he is struck in his kind of retelling of this. He reads Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, which is where God commands Abraham to leave his land and go to another place that I will show you. And that becomes sort of a life that sends him on his pilgrimage, on his peregrinatio. He does not go to Scotland or to England. He goes directly to the continent, what is at the time called Gaul, or modern-day France, to work among the Franks, which is a Germanic tribe that populated the area. Now, when he goes there, the situation is quite perilous and difficult, politically speaking, and religiously speaking. The church in this region is not all that significant or big. So there's a lot of opportunity, in other words, for him to work with folks both within and outside. He, like Patrick and like Columba, also establishes monasteries, or these institutions. And he winds up doing this throughout Gaul and all the way down into northern Italy. And again, monasteries, as I mentioned here, they wind up playing these key roles for the dissemination and preservation of culture. And that becomes very, very important, in terms of the way that he's envisioning, I suppose we could say, what missional engagement means. Our last figure then is Aiden. And Aiden is part of the story of sort of the re-Christianization of England. So after the British pull out, the Christian church, or not the British, the Romans, after the Romans pull out, the Christian church really goes on a decline in southern England and is kind of barely alive, and basically the Irish have to come in and save the day. You're welcome. Aiden is a monk at Iona, and in 635, he winds up leaving. There was a king, Oswald of Northumbria, had been in exile actually at the monastery, and he winds up returning to Northumbria to reclaim his kingdom. Aiden accompanies him, and when he does, he winds up founding the very, very famous monastery at Lindisfarne, which is off the coast of Northumbria. That was the red dot that I showed you on the map. He wanders also throughout the countryside, so he doesn't just have church services in a church. He literally wanders around. When he has permission, he preaches, and when he doesn't, he serves and cares for the poor. And so again, his story. There was a wonderful little story that I encountered about a nobleman giving him a great steed to ride around, and he decides that he would rather walk because that's what you need to do in humility, and so he sells the horse and gives the money to a poor family. So it's that kind of a sensibility. So as I mentioned here, then plays an important role in helping to rescue essentially English Christianity during this period of time. So my concluding question, which obviously I don't know if we have time, or maybe there's some thoughts you have in the room, but it really is this sense of pilgrimage that we see exhibited and embodied in these figures, and particularly in this tradition. And I'm not saying that we're supposed to be going around, establishing monasteries or anything. But if we thought about missional engagement in some sense as a journey, as a pilgrimage, how might that change the way we talk about it? How might that transform it? Maybe it'll challenge it. I don't know. But that's sort of the question that I kind of wanted to open up with some of this discussion. So I know we have maybe we can take a minute. If you need to leave, you can certainly do that. And of course, I know we all need coffee, so this won't go for very long. But thoughts in the room? Jeff Pope. He's awake.
What was the faith or religious environment in Ireland when he got there?
When Patrick got there,
Yeah.
it's predominantly pagan. So there's a couple of maybe small enclaves of Christians, but yeah, and typically headed by a Druidic priestly class. So kind of animistic, spirit world, all those kinds of things. Thoughts, questions? John? Rick?
Not a question, just a thought. I'm just struck, when I think of pilgrimage now, I think of walking the Camino. It's an event that you plan for, you save for, you study for. It's an experience you go do and come back and share about, instead of it being your everyday view of how to live out the faith. I'm on pilgrimage. Every morning I wake up, where's the pilgrimage going to take me today? It's not something I fly away and do. So that's something that strikes me. Having said that, some of the examples you used are people who gave up what they were doing and did something, and it changed their whole life. That became how they lived out their faith. It wasn't a week-long or 2-week-long experience. It was their life.
Right.
Yeah.
And it encodes in it, the language of pilgrimage encodes in it both a sense of being in exile, right? Because that's one way you hear we're pilgrims in this world. We don't want to get overly attached to this, that, or the other. Our true loyalties lie with the kingdom of God, all of which, of course, is true and gives you a sort of critical relation to your home culture or any other culture that you might encounter. But I think the other thing, the one that to me strikes me, is the way that pilgrimage, the way that they thought about it, wasn't just that it was a journey of the body, it was a journey of the soul. It was like a transformative experience. And it was meant precisely to be that. It was that was not an added benefit. That was almost sort of what drove it. And one of the arguments I was kind of trying to make theoretically, I guess the last 2 weeks, is whatever we think about missional engagement, I hope to the Lord we take away from it the idea that this is actually one of the instruments by which God is going to change us. Like we typically talk about it, this is the way we're going to change the world. Well, we need to be changed as much, if not more, oftentimes, than anything else outside. And this is part of that process, I think, that God wants to use in changing us. So discipleship, in a sense, is a part of this, I suppose, as much as anything else. Any concluding? Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming, even those of you in the far back. It's been great to see you. Next week, I'll be looking at some traditions that really center translation. We're going to talk, and they do other things, but I want to really kind of bring in the translation piece as we think about, well, what would that mean maybe for us? Remember, these are meant to be really things that spark our imagination as opposed to become cookie cutters, things that we would, precisely emulate. So anyway, let me pray us out. Lord, we thank you for, again, this day, this time. We thank you for the Irish tradition and the call and the fact that they answered that call to go on pilgrimage. May we discern our own calling and our own pilgrimage that can be transformative in our personal lives, but also in the life of our community. We ask and pray this in your name. Amen.